Good morning or good afternoon, wherever this finds you. My name's Tanya Wood. I'm the director here at the CHS Alliance. And I would just like to welcome everyone to this exciting event, which the CHS Alliance is very pleased to support. It's really heartwarming and encouraging to see the interest there is in this event, and to pull together this first ever global gathering looking at these challenges of care, culture and power in aid. The CHS Alliance gathers more than 150 organisations together, and they come together really to unite around a real commitment that we need to do more to improve how we work with and for the people that we serve. And linked to that, and that's what we're really going to focus on the next couple of days, is how each and every one of us can do more to embody the values and ideals that guide our work. And getting it right is not easy. None of this is easy. You're all buffeted in different ways by different pressures, but they're really real pressures that we're under, harsh challenges in the real nature of the work that we do. There's an intense pressure for us to deliver and do good and support the people who need the support from us. There's huge chains of funding and accountability of that funding that we work with. And there's some massive and very real power challenges that have been built into the system that we're trying to tackle every day. So these are not easy. And yet we'll all unite around this ideal that we can and will be able to do better. And we need to have these conversations. We need this conversation. And I'm personally really looking forward to what I know is going to be exciting and probably challenging conversations with you all over today and tomorrow. So with that, a huge thanks to everyone who's joined. Huge thanks to those who put this together. Particular thanks to Melissa Pitoti and Mary-Ann Clements. And now I'm going to hand you over to the very capable hands of Hope and Mary-Ann, who'll lead you through this session. Thanks so much and look forward to seeing you over the next 2 days.
Tanya.
Thanks, Tanya.
Go ahead, Hope. Go ahead.
Well, thanks very much, Tanya, for the welcome remarks. So you have decided to be in this space. This means that you have decided to choose yourself, because there are many things you could be doing, but you have chosen to be here. It takes political consciousness to choose oneself. So with that, we are going to try and bring ourselves into the space. We'll start by breathing. Breath is life. The first thing we do when we are born is to breathe. The last thing when we are born, when we die, is to breathe. So breath is what connects all of us, rich, poor, short, tall, different diversities. Even the short ones. We are connected by breath. Even if you are very tall, you don't get better air than the short ones. Yes, where you are situated might determine the kind of air that you get. And ironically, it's not necessarily the rich that get, fantastic air. This is where classes come in, but we all get it. So I'm going to invite you to just, breathe and raise your hand up as high as you can, and breathe. And then turn to your right and stretch the left side of your body. Stretch. If you are sitting on a chair, make sure the right hand touches the floor. So stretch till you really feel stretched. Don't cheat yourself. Be faithful to your body and stretch. Let's go up again. Breathe. And now we are going to turn to the left. As we turn to the left arm touches the floor, depending, even if you are sitting on the floor, and stretch. Stretch your imagination. Stretch as you think about the space today. Stretch what you want to get out of here. Stretch, because you are stretchable. Your mind is stretchable. Stretch. And then, thank you. Let's come back to the neck. Today we are going to use our voices and we need to get them ready. So, you know your voice can tell where you stand in terms of well-being. So let's try and stretch the neck gently on the right. Gently, but you know when you are stretching and you know when you've stretched enough. And keep breathing. Go as far as you can. Don't hurt yourself. Stretch. As you do this, you are clearing your throat. And your throat really tells a lot. The words that come from there, they say a lot about your conditions. Are you whimpering? Are you speaking loud? Are you speaking in a disconnected voice? How are you today? How are you feeling? What have you brought to this space? Are you happy? Are you muffled? Are you uncomfortable? Stretch and make sure that your neck is ready to deliver the messages from your body. Let's turn to the other side and stretch this side. Turn to the left, stretch, and make sure that your arm supports the left as you stretch. Stretch, stretch. Whew, to the center again, and then the back. Back as far as you can go. Oof, and then the front. So let's do 2 neck rotations. As you rotate, you breathe in, breathe in, and breathe out. Breathe out, breathe out, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe in, breathe out. Let's now try the other side. Breathe in, the opposite side. Breathe out. Breathe in. Then breathe out. And then let's try and stretch again. Stretch, stretch, stretch as much as you can. Touch the sky. Stretch. We are all stretchable. We are all stretchable. Our imaginations are stretchable. So let's stretch, stretch, stretch. And then, calm down. And as we calm down, let's close our eyes for a few minutes and set our intentions for today. We are energy, and what we set out to do is what happens. So let's set our intentions and think about the seeds that we are going to plant in today's meeting. What seeds? Are they seeds of hope? Are they seeds of joy? Are they seeds of recommitment to your own well-being? Are they seeds of changing your organizational culture? Are they seeds that are going to sprout as you sprout yourself? What kind of seeds do you want to plant in these 2 days? So think about it, and as you think about it, you are really setting your intentions for the 2 days. So a minute, set our intentions for 2 days. Okay, so thanks very much. And before we begin, we want to bring India into the space. We want to bring all people who have lost loved ones. We want to bring activists who are working in very, very, very difficult circumstances. We want to bring those who labor every day. We want to bring those who really, really work hard to make other people's lives better. These are some of the people who are never appreciated. We want to bring silenced voices. We want to bring invisible women who do a lot of work but are never seen, even in these spaces where we are. We want to bring everyone in this space and send them energy, send them love and appreciation. So thanks very much for choosing yourself today. And we look forward to being with you in these 2 days. Have a great time. Just smile. The world is not as bad as we think. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hope, for opening our session and really inviting us all to check in with how we're doing and also to think about what we're really here for and what our intentions are. I want to start from the perspective of the initiative that this event has come out of with just a few words about why we're here and how we come to be here. So I'm Marianne Clements, and I've been working with CHS Alliance, and as Tanya said in her welcome, particularly with Melissa Pitotti, for the last about 18 months on this project. And this initiative began with a mapping around the topic of how do we cultivate caring and compassionate aid organisations? And through that mapping, through the conversations we had with over 100 people in our initial piece of work, we planted some seeds, really, that we've been tending to ever since. So that happened in autumn of 2019, before COVID, before the times we find ourselves in many ways. But since that time, we've been tending to those seeds we planted through ongoing outreach and conversations, and last year through some facilitated conversations that Hope and I were part of, and there were a couple of other facilitators, Uma and Haida, were also a part of. And in our second session this morning after this opening, we're going to share a bit more about those conversations and what we learned from them. But we held them in different regions in different parts of the world, and we asked people to share about what they saw as the ways to build care and compassion in their organisations, but also about the challenges, also about the things that weren't working so well, and about what could be done about them. So there'll be more about that in the next session. But I wanted just to give a brief overview of some of the things that we found in that initial mapping. You can find a report of it in the reception area. It's called Working Well, but I wanted to just pull out maybe 3 points from it. So one thing we found was that across the sector, across CHS Alliance members and other organisations working in the aid and development sector, there were quite a lot of initiatives around organisational well-being, particularly sort of individual well-being within organisations and staff care. There were quite a few people thinking about and talking about organisational culture. And many of those things were not connected. So people weren't connected. So they might be doing something in their organisation and they didn't know who else was doing something similar in another organisation. And so one of the things that brings us here for this 2-day event is the desire to continue to connect people. And we've done some of that already, and we'll be doing more of it through our schedule over these 2 days. But the desire to connect people who are working on issues of well-being, issues of care and compassion in our work, and issues of culture, organisational culture and power. And so one of the reasons we're here is because we found that people wanted to be more connected. And I think it's already been said this morning, we can't do this work on our own individually. This is a collective endeavour. And so bringing people together feels fundamental to it. And that's one of the reasons why we've chosen this conference platform, because it hopefully facilitates more interaction between the people who are attending as well as those who are speaking and sharing and offering workshops. We also found in our mapping that the provision of specific support for wellbeing within humanitarian and development organisations was often inequitable. In other words, care might be provided for some kinds of staff and not others. Or care might be provided in some organisations and not others. Often care was provided perhaps to international staff and not to national staff, or not at the same level. Or care was provided within the international organisation, but maybe not to partners. And so we wanted to really ask questions about what does it mean to care for everyone who's engaged in work for change in the world? How do we make care and well-being more equitable to access within the sector in general? How do we think about who deserves care and what that looks like, and how that can be something that we think about collectively as well as individually? And the other thing that we found in all our conversations with people was that organizational culture and systemic issues, and not just individual and personal issues, were a really important part of how we could think about well-being. And so we have come to this event with a broader remit than we began with. We began talking about caring and compassionate aid organizations, and in this event, which we've called Living Our Values, Care, Culture and Power in Aid Organizations, we really want to make the links between care, well-being, how staff are treated, how they experience their work, and organizational culture, like what are our organizations like? How do people experience them? How do we treat people both within them and the people that we interact with beyond them? And how does power play into that? And so that's why you're here for an event that's called Living Our Values, Care, Culture and Power in Aid Organizations. And that's why our speakers this morning in the opening session are coming from different perspectives of this conversation. So we're going to hear from Frances shortly around her work on safeguarding and culture in the sector. And we're going to hear from Jessica Horn around well-being and decolonizing well-being, and what does it mean to think about care in a collective way. And then we're going to hear from Lena around her work on, particularly on anti-racism with the development sector in the UK, and how well-being is an important part of the conversation about racial justice in our work. And we hope that in hearing from those different perspectives in the opening session, we're going to begin to weave together these threads of conversation that we think are deeply connected, but which perhaps we don't always have together in the same space. And so we hope that this opening session will be a real jumping off point for the rest of our 2 days together, in which different sessions will pick up different parts of these themes. I'm not going to go through the whole schedule, but you should be able to see it in the reception area and choose the sessions you want to join us for. Some of them are going to be discussions, a bit like this one. Others are going to be more interactive. Tomorrow we've got more workshops and interactive sessions. And you can pick the ones that feel most resonant for you. But in all of them, we're going to be touching on some, if not all of these themes and weaving them together. So now I've set the scene, I hope, I'm going to introduce Frances Longley to you. So Frances is the incoming new CEO at ActionAid UK. And she was previously Executive Director for Programmes and Policy at Care International. And before that, Chief Executive of AMREF Health Africa UK. And we've particularly invited Frances today to talk a bit about the work she's been doing related to safeguarding and culture. And I'm just going to invite Frances to share about it without further ado, I think, if we can hear you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Marianne. And thank you, Hope, for that brilliant kind of warm up and focusing. That's brilliant. I'm going to start doing that, I think, every morning. I was feeling inspired. I might start doing that with my team. It's good. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. This is a brilliant event, and I really congratulate Marianne on the work that she's done to bring us together with colleagues to make this happen. It's such an important topic. So as Marianne mentioned, I'm here really to talk a bit about some of the work I've been involved in on safeguarding. So 3 years ago, we will all remember back in 2018, there was a huge kind of reckoning, I think, in our sector as a result of media stories about abuse and about failures in reporting and various other really serious concerns around safeguarding. It started with stories about Oxfam, but rapidly other stories about other organisations came out. And I think all of us were brought up short and realised that we needed to really come together and address these concerns very seriously, Some excellent work had already been going on. There were organisations who were doing really good things, organisations of all sizes in all parts of the world who were doing very good work. But too many of us were not consistent enough and we're not prioritising enough. And as a sector as a whole, globally, we couldn't really hold our heads up high in the way that we should do. So I volunteered to be part of a working group which was put together in the UK through Bond, and Lena can speak a bit more about Bond later. Lena and I have done lots of work together over the last few years. She's a very important part of the Bond team, as well as other very important things that she's doing. So I worked together with colleagues and I chaired one of 4 working groups. So we put together 4 groups. There was one about the employment cycle. There was a group that was about reporting. There was a group about designing safer programming. And we had a group which focused very deliberately on leadership and culture. And it was structured in such a way that it was recognised that our group's work was an umbrella for the more kind of practical and process-driven work that the other groups were focusing on. Because what's really clear to us, and I hope to all of you, is that safeguarding, whether that be in the sense of preventing sexual exploitation, abuse and harm, or in its wider context of also looking at bullying and tackling all sorts of other ills in our organisations, which are about failures to respect each other and to treat each other well, and about abuses of power of all kinds. That work can only succeed with good leadership and with really healthy cultures. So we set about doing some work on that, and we spent really, I think, a lot longer than we thought we might have done. I have been co-chairing that working group with my very brilliant colleague, Sally Proudlove, who works for UNICEF and is a real expert in the area of safeguarding, has been a great inspiration to me. And we have been working on that for the last 3 years. And I'm very happy to say that just a few weeks ago, we finally launched the fruit of this work, which I would really like to encourage you all to investigate. So what we did was that we developed a tool for leaders, and we're using leaders in the widest possible sense of that. You could be heading up a whole organisation, you might be leading a team, you might be showing leadership on a project, it could be all kinds of leadership, but it is a tool for leaders to help you, to help us, to understand better what's going on in our organisations culturally around safeguarding, and to identify really tangible things that we can do to improve what's going on within our safeguarding cultures in our organisations. So we put together a really tight task team who worked on this, and it was very thoughtful composition in this team. We had thought very much about representation in terms of sex and gender and ethnicity, geographical location, different types of expertise. We looked at, we had an academic, we had practitioners, we had people who had been working in a policy context, and also people who had been working in a very practical kind of, actually, you know, dealing with practical issues of designing and implementing safeguarding and dealing with survivors and carrying out investigations. So it was really a very rounded group, very deliberately put together. And that group came up with an approach rooted, I'm happy to say, in the core humanitarian standards. We didn't want to reinvent a whole different set of language and ideas. So we drew on the core humanitarian standards which guide us all. And we came up with a tool which you can work through. It's got 6 sections in it. We talk about accountability, policies and processes, do no harm and safer programming. We talk about survivor-centered approaches, awareness raising, and then safer recruitment and HR. It's available online. This is my sales pitch because this is the most important thing I'm going to tell you all morning. It is free of charge. I am biased, but trust me, it's brilliant. It is really easy to work your way through. You can do it. We recommend people do it one section at a time. You do it with your board, do it with your senior team, do it with colleagues who are leading projects. work through it at your own pace. And at the end of each section, you'll come up with practical things which you can put times and deadlines against, and you have a plan. It's honestly fabulous. I say that because I was not in the task team. So I can say with all humility, it's brilliant. So my that's my sales pitch. You can Google safeguarding tool bond. I promise you'll find it. It's free of charge. It'll change your life and your organization. So there's the sales pitch. What I want to also say is that I've not just been involved in that project. I've also been doing an awful lot of work around culture, kind of in my day job. For many years, actually. I am a bit of a culture and leadership fanatic, but what I have learned through this process of the safeguarding journey, which has really informed the work that I do within organisations where I'm a leader, is just a reinforcement of the importance of culture. What we learned through safeguarding is that policies and processes don't do the trick. We've all got policies and processes, and yet bad things can happen in our organisations. What we learnt is that you need to take yourself and your organisation on a journey from probably non-compliance with this policy you've just written, because you've only just written it, through to compliance, and then through to the really interesting stage, which is having a healthy culture. And some of the hallmarks of that culture are about actually not needing a lot of rule keeping, because what you have is an environment where people check their own behaviour, because they know that everyone around them is also checking their own behaviour. You know, one of the examples we always give is things like, you know, if the person who sits next to you in the office is always 10 minutes late for work, you just start thinking, why am I getting up 10 minutes earlier than they are and getting to work on time? It obviously doesn't matter. I'll be a few minutes late. I'll get the next train. I'll have that extra cup of coffee, whatever it might be. And your sense previously of discipline and respect for others and sticking to the rules that you signed up to just gets eroded, not because anyone has said it doesn't matter, because you've observed that in your organisation it doesn't matter. And getting somewhere in time maybe doesn't seem very important, but when the other things you start to observe and absorb that they're not really valued, there are no real consequences to changing, you know, to not meeting those standards, you actually just start eroding all kinds of other behaviours. You know, the person who's, you know, pinching a few things from the office stationery cupboard can very easily become the person who's just fudging the accounts a little bit, because it's a slippery slope, because it's to do with how you approach culture in your organisation. And we know if you have a culture which is rooted in respect, in generosity, it's rooted in kindness and thoughtfulness, and it's also rooted in courage, then we know we hold each other to account, we hold ourselves to account, and we all maintain a higher level. When all of those seemingly small things are allowed to go, when I'm allowed to shout at you because I'm in a bad mood this morning and no one calls me out on it, you know, whatever it might be, actually the whole pack of cards just crumbles in front of us. And we find ourselves in circumstances where diabolical things are happening, and it's very hard to pull it back. So the lesson I've learned over many years is just the power of a healthy culture. As a leader, if you can keep your culture healthy, frankly, the rest of it's going to sort itself out. So it's a good move for you as a leader, I can tell you. But it's the way to actually create organisations which are capable of living up to the expectations which people rightly have for us. If we want to do no harm, we first need to get our houses in order. So I would very much encourage you to take a look at this tool. It's taken us years. I can't believe how long it's taken us. It's digital, it's glorious, it's free of charge. It'll change your life, I promise. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Frances. I just want to come in before I hand to Hope and just to say what I put in the chat, which is there's a Q&A section on that. So for those that are new to hop in, which is most of us, I think, saying that just because I started with it like a week or two ago. On the right, you'll see there are different chats. There's a chat which is for the whole event, and then there's a chat that's the stage. And the chat for the stage is like the chat for this session, and in there you'll see there's a Q&A. So you can come into that Q&A with questions for us, and we will pick those up after we've heard from each of our panelists this morning. So Hope, let me hand to you.
I think I'm going to introduce you. Be ready. Fasten your seatbelt. All crimes you've committed against me are going to be revealed. Anyway, Jessica, I've known Jessica for many years, and that's why I can afford to tease her. Jessica is affectionately known as Akik. Akik is a pet name which people from western part of Uganda, the mountains of Rwenzori, adopt when they are born. So it's a beautiful name, Akik. So I'll call her Akik. So she's a feminist practitioner with an inclination towards digging deeper, inspiring activist alchemy, and asking where next. Her work is situated politically in Pan-Africanism and practically in interventions that affirm women's rights to live pleasurable, embodied lives free from violence, and resource activism and build themselves. Jessica is a global citizen, but some of her ancestors are hidden along Mount Rwenzori in Western Uganda. They are farmers, they are healers, they dance, they sing, they are everything. So it's not surprising that Jessica is a poet, she's a writer, she's a dancer, and she's a feminist activist. It's rare that one gets a combination of all these things. So if you want to know, you want to read poetry, you want someone to write, you want a dancer, there is Jessica for you. She's found creating spaces of African feminists organizing and healing. And last year, before COVID, she organized a healing space for women who care for other women, and she called the space Flourishing. Flourishing was a very interesting space in Ghana because it enabled some of the activists to continue with the work during COVID and support women who were being haunted by violence because of the nature of being locked down with violent people. She considers well-being in terms of culture, in terms of where we all come from, because well-being really means different things to different people. What might be considered well in the West might not be considered well in Ghana or in Uganda. And well-being too, it's culture. We've gone to, we seem to think that there is one way of being well, but there are many ways of being well. And Jessica, has tried to do this work. She led the development of African Institute for Integrated Response to Violence Against Women and HIV. And when she led this initiative, she considered holistic healing. And this meant women were able to share their stories. The stories were documented. Resources for supporting them were shared. And there was counseling on the side. So meaning that you can be well, yes, but you also need to be resources to be well. Sometimes you need counseling, sometimes you need support. But the story, voice is important. As I said at the beginning, the story has to be written. So most of this is captured in her article, Decolonizing Emotional Well-Being and Mental Health in Development, African Feminist Innovations. So I could go on and on, but Jessica believes that well-being is not individual. It might be individual, but it's collective as well. You are well when others are well. It's very difficult to be well alone. You need others. And she sees well-being as part of feminist movement and brings well-being into everything she does, including her poetry, including her dances. She dances well-being, and including many other things. So Jessica, you are very welcome. And join me in welcoming Akik, who hails from the mountain of Rwenzori. Jessica.
I'm actually not sure what I'm supposed to do after that introduction. Hope Chigudu, the original hype woman. Well, praise singer. I appreciate that. Hope, and I really sincerely hope that I don't disappoint all of you after that. Interesting. So, I mean, a lot of things have come out already in the conversation that we've had. Thank you, Hope, for the stretching. I really needed it this morning to ground. And also, Marianne, when you were talking about tending, I love that we're using the metaphor of gardening, because I think that actually, if you garden, even in a small way, it opens you up to a completely different time scale. Understanding how long things take, the patience that it requires, the fact that you constantly have to pull out weeds and, you know what I mean, just really take care as a daily practice if you want to maintain a beautiful garden. And so I feel like that's a great metaphor for thinking about what we're doing. Because as Francis was saying, I mean, culture is built all the time. It's not something that you sort of just define, you know, in a sheet of paper and then leave. It's something that you tend to. You know, and if you tend to the beautiful parts of the culture, they will grow. You know, if you allow like bindweeds to spread, they will come and choke everything. You know, so you actually have to tend, and that's something really important. But what I wanted to do is to share some reflections, partly based on the piece, Decolonizing Emotional Wellbeing and Mental Health, just because it was actually thoughts about praxis. You know, it was actually thoughts about things that we did to really engage and try and think about what does it mean to support feminist care and emotional well-being in work that is engaging with quite extreme contexts of violence and displacement, stigmatization, and everyday patriarchies as well. What does it mean to really think about trauma? What is trauma? And is it time that we reconceptualize it? Also reconceptualize the responses to it. So as Hope mentioned, I mean, I've been a part of a number of initiatives that have been primarily in African feminist space that are around building up infrastructure, you know, actually building up the spaces. So imagining what they might be like, but also building up the practice of creating spaces and processes where we can actually engage in care. The work in its early days used to be called Caring for Carers or Defending Defenders in the Women Human Rights Defenders universe, and it's now sort of transitioned into this language of care and well-being. And I should say that Hope is actually really a pioneer in this field. I mean, a good 20 years ago, she was speaking about this and helped Urgent Action Fund Africa and the Urgent Action Fund Sisters to actually build up this sort of work, which has now become, as I said, quite common in the field in general. So just to also acknowledge kind of some of the roots of it. So I just wanted to speak through 4 ideas, which for me help ground and navigate in terms of thinking about these questions of care. So the first is that activist work is inherently emotional. So, you know, we work in very technocratic cultures in the development sector, humanitarianism, perhaps even more so, so many standards, so many regulations, and also very much drawn on, to be fair, if we're thinking about decolonizing, a sort of Enlightenment idea, Cartesian ideas of a division of the rational and the emotional, and the idea that to be professional means to be sort of, you know, just rational, programmed, conforming to time, delivering, right, all of that, which is also very much part of kind of capitalist processes of sort of production and the development mindset. So in these sectors, we really have this idea that they shouldn't be emotional spaces. And in some respects, that's an inherent contradiction with the reality of the space. Most people, not all, but most people come to development work, to humanitarian work, because they have some kind of heartfelt concern for the injustices in the world, in whatever way that may be. They may be a doctor who just really wants to help alleviate suffering in contexts where that's, you know, quite hard to do, right? There may be people, even finance people, who actually just think, you know what, I'd actually like to give my energies to this rather than working in the corporate sector. I'd actually like to give my energies to helping people in some way. So there's a heart connection that begins the journey of why we even work in this space in the first place. The second thing, which is something I think that we recognize a little bit less, and I think some of Francis's work is trying to get to this, is that the work itself is also emotional. And we always think about the interaction with, you know, the field, the communities, but the workspace is emotional, right? So what do we do, for example, when we're working in organizations that have a beautifully articulated ethics and they're not living up to them? When we feel like leadership are making decisions that are antithetical to the way that we're supposed to be, or we claim to be engaging, or where, as we're saying, we see individual staff doing things and they never get checked on it, right? And we know that it's wrong. All of that is very, very emotional. You know, we get stressed out because there's this inherent conflict between the things that we think are right and the things that are actually happening in this space. So it's important to acknowledge that this work is inherently emotional. And if we begin with that, we normalize the idea that then it's important to consider the emotional dimension of the work in what we do, and even to put resources to thinking about it and practices around it, etc. The second is that well-being is inherently political. In the current framework, and particularly as we're sort of scrambling around trying to think about how to do this work, because it's become a big thing now, we're resorting a lot to sort of the conventional psychology, conventional Western psychology, which tends to individualize and atomize problems. It says, for example, with trauma is a result of you experiencing something terrible. And in order to get over that, you need to speak one-on-one with somebody. They'll help you through a process and then you'll be better, right? So the sort of highly individualized notion of what it takes to address the lack of well-being or to sort of promote well-being. In real terms, all distress is situated in structural inequalities. And that's something in the context of air that we found very clearly, because we're dealing, I mean, if you're looking at, say, for example, like a woman refugee from Eastern Congo living in a township in Johannesburg, why is she suicidal? It's not because she has a chemical imbalance in her body or whatever. Fine, that may well be so. Or she needs this medication, or she went off her meds or whatever. Okay, that might be so. But why is she even in the space of distress in the first place? Right? Because there was an armed conflict fueled by mineral extraction that forced her from her home. There were a whole range of problematic border policies, right? Experiences of interaction with armed forces that were not protecting her. Entering into a space where she has very limited rights as a migrant, right? A lack of economic rights, no housing, no food, no healthcare. The structural environment is what creates her distress. So if you want to heal that woman, you could potentially give her access to a psychologist or psychiatrist that might help her some aspect of it. But in real terms, if we're trying to heal distress, we have to heal the structure that caused it. That's a preventative approach. So as I said, this work of well-being is inherently and always political. Thirdly, and linked to that, I'm going to go a bit faster, well-being is also collective. And again, linked to this idea that, you know, we all live in community. We're all part of family of some kind or another, chosen or, you know, bloodline or whatever. We all come and we all situated somewhere, even work communities. When one person is distressed, it affects other people. Other people care about them, other people, I mean, it's lots of effects, right? So we have to get over this idea that, again, the issues are individual. We have to think about these issues as being collective issues. And so thinking about our interventions also as being interventions that affect and help a collective too. And that's one thing also about thinking about caring for carers, is that carers actually exist in the sphere that is the sphere of the collective, right? Of the people engaging with individual pain, individual trauma, individual distress. Lastly, I think is sort of an important point for this, particularly because the way the AIDS sector is structured epistemologically almost, is that it's this idea that sort of usually far more privileged, knowledgeable people with more resources come in and help these people who are experiencing distress in different ways or marginalized or what have you. And there's this notion of vicarious trauma, which is quite common, we often discuss. Which is the idea that as you do that, you are then exposed to all of their pain and their horror, and that you are affected by it too, and it also causes problems for you. Conceptually, that's slightly problematic because it does create this notion of the burden, right? And that the idea that the communities that we're engaging are burdens on us in some way, even emotionally. Now, a group of researchers sort of engaged with sort of human rights defenders and care workers in Colombia to research this concept of vicarious resilience. And what they found was that actually, in interacting with communities who are experiencing distress in very serious ways, people actually learned a lot. They emboldened in their bravery and their courage. They learned techniques for survival. So to also consider that there's a different kind of flow that happens, that actually the communities that we're in solidarity with, working with, and alongside also give us something. They give us insight into how to navigate this life, right? And they also help build our resilience. So again, to just unsettle a little bit that slightly problematic power dynamic where we're thinking of this sort of benevolent and oversharing, overgiving aid worker that goes into this community who only drains you emotionally. To also take stock of and consider and map how is it that the communities that we're engaging are also giving and sharing and giving us a sense about what it means to be alive. So I'm going to end there, but I hope that we can explore some of these questions also in the conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm going to invite you to, go to the Q&A with questions about this, and we're going to come to Lena first. I'm going to do my attempt at a praise song, and I'm not as practiced as Hope, so I'm feeling like, how do I follow that also? And I'm going to do my best. So Lena is the lead on anti-racism work at Bond, who are the network for UK organisations working in development. And she's currently rolling out sector support to help the sector to think about how we build anti-racism as a practice, and particularly engaging with people who are in positions of power. And at the same time, she's also worked with Bond at Bond to create a working group that's dedicated space for people of colour working in the sector to come together, sharing their experiences and learnings and support, and also to help influence the sector. Lena's done so much work on these issues over the past year or two, and it's been a real joy and pleasure for me personally to interact with her, engage with her on these issues. But at the same time as doing all this work within Bond that's so vital for our sector, especially in the UK, she's also a committee member of Charity So White, which is a campaign aiming to root out racism in the charitable sector more broadly, and is on the working group of something called the Racial Equity Index, who are looking to create an index for the international, I think, development sector, specifically around race. I'm going to let Lena also share a bit more about herself and her work, and but know that the praises are big and bold also. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Marianne, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all. Yes, so I'm leading the anti-racism work for Bond, which means doing a lot of work on those conversations and inviting people in, as Jessica said, to talk about the issues that we have across the sector, to engage with people who are in positions of power across the sector, so that this work on uncovering the roots of the sector, on not shying away from it anymore, on engaging and really being meaningful to address the inequities that are across our sector, to encourage people to come into those conversations, to challenge themselves as well. And so a lot of the work that I do is really uncomfortable. But I have learned to become comfortable in that uncomfortability. It's something that it doesn't really get any easier, but for me, and I know for many other people who work in the activism space and who do this work, it's too important. The idea of not doing this and not engaging in difficult conversations is much harder than ignoring it. And I think for a sector, we've ignored a lot of the issues that we have in terms of power imbalances, why we are as a sector the way we are right now. We do tend to be very reactive. We react to the environments around us, to global issues, of course. And as we've spoken about and heard from the other speakers, people get into this sector because they connect to the missions. And that idea of people who are do-gooders not being able to be the kinds of people who perpetuate inequalities and unjust power imbalances across our sector is something that we need to talk about more. And it isn't the easiest thing to engage with people on, but I think obviously since last year, since the murder of George Floyd, since the global demonstrations of Black Lives Matter, it's something that we can't ignore anymore. And that's really sad that it took that for our sector to engage with this issue more meaningfully, I would say. As Francis said, you know, the safeguarding work that Bond has been doing, we dove into that and really meaningfully supported the sector on trying to shift the culture. And it's an interesting thing to see us now in May 2021, when, as particularly in the UK, since last summer till even early this year, we've been seeing lots of stories in the sector press about cultures that are toxic and that are not working for everyone. And there's still a lot more work that we need to do on that. And it will take all of us to change the way that we do work. So my work in Bond, and specifically on the anti-racism work, is to engage with those people who are in positions of power across the sector, so that we can recognize it's not just one person's problem, it's all of our problem. It's not just HR, it's not just the CEO who runs organizations, it's the board members who need to recognize their role in governance and take a look at themselves to see, do they really reflect the communities that we work with? Are they really informed? Also directors of campaigns, communications and fundraising, to really think about and interrogate the imagery that we use, the narrative that we use. Language is so important in this sector. It means something. It paints pictures for people. And are we being intentional about that? Also, directors of policy, again, especially through Bond and through the membership that we have, we do an incredible amount of advocating and lobbying for communities. But how well informed are we? Who are in the rooms when we are making decisions about what issues we take forward to government officials, to donors, to each other? How informed are we? And directors of programs. So it's a very interesting and complex issue, being an NGO in the UK and having country offices. And so exploring those power imbalances that work there. And then finally, HR. And as Marianne said, I have created a POC, so a People of Colour in Development group. And that has really been, I think, transformational for a lot of people. When I started that group with two incredible people as well, I definitely underestimated how much that space was needed for communities to come together, to be able to feel like they can really be themselves and know that they could be validated, know that their experiences do mean something and do matter, and they are shared by so many people across the sector. And so that space is sacred, really, not only to support and share, you know, experiences, but also to heal. Healing is so important. The trauma of what we do, what I do through Bond, what I do through Charity So White and the Racial Equity Index. Being an activist, yeah, it's really challenging, it's exhausting, and it's something that we need to talk more about in terms of self-care and well-being. The idea of slowing down in our sector, I don't know who is comfortable with that, because we are in the sector to change the world, which is amazing, but how much needs to be done now? And what can we truly realistically do now if we're not looking after ourselves? One of the things that I really am mindful of in terms of organizational culture is the system that we work in, the way that we do have deadlines and work very closely to them and go all out to meet those deadlines. It's something that we need to talk about more. And I think it's challenging for senior people, perhaps, who feel the pressure of having to deliver, to be accountable to higher ups, but that does nothing to support staff lower down, to support partners that we work with. It doesn't work for everyone. And I think one of the things that we've seen particularly in lockdown, is that burnout is at a higher rate. Women definitely are talking more about how they are not just one thing. They are not just a female worker. They are a mother and a daughter and a carer. They're a cook and a cleaner. And of course, men could also do that. But it is something that we're hearing more and more about. We are not just one thing. We're not one-dimensional. And we have so many different parts to us. And the things that are going on around the world, doing the work that we do, hearing about the crises that are going on around the world, seeing a Black man be murdered on camera, this affects us. This affects us all in ways that we don't, I think, fully understand. And we take this in and we absorb it into our bones and into our being. And that changes the way that we are able to cope with things. So when we come to work, we're carrying all of that. We're carrying all of that, and we don't, I think, spend enough time unpacking that to recognize that we are all dealing with other things, as well as the emails and the work and the projects and the mail that we need to do. And so something that I've been fond of and what I've learned so much in the activist space about checking in with people, about the very simplest practices of just doing, a check-in of traffic lights, red, amber or green, just to check in with your staff to see how are they actually doing, because people are not okay at the moment, and particularly in racial justice and the racial justice space. Being a person of color across 2020 has been hugely difficult, and even now, but this is not something that has just come to the fore now. People of color definitely move through the world in a different way and have to adapt for a world that perhaps doesn't support them or know that it should support them in a different way. And so what we do is we learn to adapt, we learn to assimilate, and we continue on until somebody triggers us or somebody opens our eyes to say, actually, are you okay with this? Are you okay with the way that you're being dealt with, the things that are being asked of you, the time that you're asked to spend on certain things that go above and beyond, until someone checks in with us and it gives us pause for thought to think, actually, am I okay? Am I actually okay? And many times it will be that they're not. The whole idea of the sector is very deep, and it's something that I work on and talk to the people who I work with in Bond and the groups of senior leaders that I work with and organizations. And I think it's so powerful to understand our history, because when we understand our history, we understand how we got to where we are now. And that is a really powerful thing. Knowledge is power, and it's really powerful to be able to understand why things are the way they are. And then we can start to move to dismantling it and to thinking outside of the box. Do we really need to set such strict deadlines? Why do we do that? A lot of the work that I do in the activism space is about questioning why things are the way that they are, so that we can think differently and so that we can make our organizations and our work for everybody. In the sector, we talk a lot about our missions being to ensure the most marginalized people do not get left behind around the world. But how often do we think about the marginalized people in our organizations? And do our organizations work for those people? And that's a hard question. That's a really hard question to confront yourself with, to open up to, and to be challenged on. But that's what it will take to really move the sector forward and to create the type of inclusive organizations that we want to have. And certainly, as Francis said as well, this is not a tick box exercise. This is not something that there is a full blueprint for. A lot of people that I see in the sector do want to just make things happen quickly and just like tick the box and make it okay for people. But in order to be okay, we need to get through the harder stuff first. And that's a lot of heavy stuff, but it's definitely worth it, because once we start to embed well-being into our organizations and really think about equitable solutions that support people who are not the majority, then we are going to start becoming more resilient and becoming stronger as a sector. And recognizing one of the biggest things that I think in this work for me, including with mental health and well-being, is accountability. And recognizing that you really do have to be, specifically for the anti-racist work that I do, racial justice work that I do, you've got to be accountable to the people of color in your organizations, to understand how they're experiencing the organization, and to your partners and the communities that you work with. How do they feel, honestly, about working with you, working with your organization, and what can you do to make it better? So those are just a few thoughts there.
Thank you, Lena, for bringing that thread in as well. I feel like we're weaving a thread of conversation around topics that intersect, and we've got some really interesting questions in the Q&A. So I hope that we can come to some of those now. So I think let's just begin with one from the Q&A, and I'm going to read out a question, and then maybe a few of us can respond to it. So, can technocratic tools be a solution to these power dynamics? These issues are often undiscussables. Leadership often know what's going on, but there's a failure to act with accountability. Take recent examples from Amnesty UK. Leadership knew for years but there was inaction. Culture may not change without demand or imperative from below. I might come to you, Frances, if that's okay, for some
Thanks
thoughts
very
on that
much,
one.
Marianne. And just to say to Jessica and Lena, thank you so much for those contributions. Just always fantastic to hear you both speak. Yeah, the technocratic tools are not the answer. I know I gave a big sales pitch for our fabulous safeguarding tool, and I'm super committed to it. It's not the answer. It's part of creating ways for leaders who are committed to this change to do the work they need to do. So if you're a leader who is not interested in tackling the problems in your culture, is not interested in looking with real honesty at the power dynamics within your organization and the imbalances and the abuses of power in your organization, you know, you can work your way through this tool or any other tool. You can read the management books, you can go on the courses. If you're not committed to it, it won't make a blind bit of difference. And I'm the first to say that. If you are committed to it, I think there are a lot of leaders out there who want to do better, who want to be accountable, who want to be driving change, and don't always know where to start. You know, just because you're in a leadership position, it doesn't mean you know how to do everything. Far from it. And they're looking for good ways to make their way on this journey of change. And the safeguarding tool is one. Obviously, it was developed very specifically around safeguarding, and that's the focus. But we have created this kind of wider cultural approach within it. But yeah, I mean, the big change is exactly what Lena was talking about. It's about us all being honest about the structural inequalities in our organisations, about the behaviours that have been allowed to go on for many years, about the things that we haven't given enough attention to, we haven't given enough focus to, that we've looked at and said, either not noticed it, because, you know, I mean, look at me. I'm a white, middle-aged, middle-class British woman. I reek of privilege. I am extremely aware of that. And there are many things which it is easy for me not to notice, or to choose not to notice, or to choose not to act upon. And my responsibility is that I must look hard at those issues. I must listen. I must make myself accountable to people of colour and others in my organisation and beyond it. And that's the challenge for me as a leader. That's the conversation. I've been in ActionAid since Monday, and ActionAid, being the fabulously activist organisation that it is, I've already had that conversation several times this week, and I'm glad about that, because I have a staff team and an organisation who will hold me to account, and that's what I want. And that needs to be a partnership. But yeah, I agree. A tool's not going to fix it. It's not going to reconfigure the aid sector. It's not going to dismantle unequal power structures, but it can help people who are already committed to that fight. And I think we all need some help. So yeah.
Can we jump in? Just a quick thought that
Please do.
yeah, I mean, thank you. No, I agree with Francis. I think we need to think about change on this issue in the same way that we have come to understand how change works with everything, which is from an ecosystemic point of view. Like, there's never any one thing that's going to help. So I think the thing about policy is the same kind of in thinking about, say, policy on women's rights, right? Or it's like policy in and of itself, or law in and of itself, does not lead to feminist transformation and the deconstruction of patriarchy. However, if you do not have standards that you can hold people to account, it actually makes the other work so much harder. So I feel like just the fact that we're going through almost like a re-norming at the moment is good, because what it's doing is just clarifying the terms of what we're talking about. And that's happening through the sort of policies, etc. What it then means, though, too, is that people have a very explicit document to say, and now you're not living up to this, whereas before that wasn't necessarily as explicit. So I think that there's power in naming standards. But again, to make anything real, of course, it has to be done with intention, and it has to be, I mean, the culture piece and shifting power, as I was arguing, this is all political, and what political means is that it's about power. Shifting power has to happen to make it meaningful. But I still think that having standards is important, and also constant reflection on them, because things may change. I mean, I think some of the language is interesting, safeguarding. I mean, when I was at the African Women's Development Fund, we sort of looked at it, and, you know, a lot of donors were asking for these policies, and just thought, well, but feminists have always done that. We call it building safe space. So we call it the safe spaces policy, because that's actually from the movement perspective, that's been the ethic that's guided us, right? And so thinking about not safeguarding, building safe spaces. What does it mean to do that? So again, I just think it's about sort of navigating, thinking about power, but having norms, normative standards that at least are one tool of accountability.
I will also jump in. Okay. I think they do. I agree with both. Yeah, Francis and Jessica. You do need a multi-pronged approach to this, and you do need to be held accountable. If you don't have any policies, then you've got nothing in place. But it's about how do you practice those policies, and actually in a meaningful way. It can't just be the words. And I think too often it stops at policy. It stops at there's a document, go and read it. That's it. Doesn't get enforced, doesn't get practiced. And in order to have practice of those policies, you need a mindset shift. You need to have the challenges opening up. You need to have people being vulnerable and being open to change, and also to understand how this makes everyone's life better. Because it's not just about supporting marginalized people, it's about everyone.
I think you're muted, Marianne. I wonder if maybe because she's freezing, people could take some of it. Oh,
I think her screen has frozen. Yeah, but let's continue. Anyone who has questions can ask. Any questions?
I can just follow up on the question which Francis answered about leadership as well. It does take, so leaders in our sector have been there for quite a while, and then they do move around. But this is about what type of leadership do we want in the sector. And I think this is about leaders looking at themselves and their own journey to understand perhaps what leadership looked like 5-10 years ago is not what we need right now. And I think part of that is about looking at yourself, your power, the privilege that you hold, as Francis said, but sharing that power, being open to understand that leadership may not always be the person at the front, the person whose voice is always heard, but actually leading from the back. And I think there's something really powerful about leaders being vulnerable and being authentic, to say if they're not okay, to say if they're struggling, to say if they don't know something. And I wonder like how we can get to a place where we start to see that more, because it means that then that becomes normalized. You know, we have something in the UK where, you know, the British stiff upper lip, where we don't show emotions and we hide behind it's all fine. You're like crumbling inside, and we need to start getting like reconciling that to be okay with not being okay, because I don't really know anyone who is okay. And that's all kinds of creeds and races, and we need to be able to get to a place where we can do that. And if we are able to see leaders do that, I think that can be really powerful.
Thanks very much. And how might we connect well-being to other processes of change? You've kind of alluded to that, because well-being is within a culture. You know, it happens within the culture of the organization. It happens within the context of the organization. It happens within the stage of growth of the organization. But how might we then connect it with other processes of change? Any of you can jump in.
I'll jump in if I may.
Yes.
I think this question of well-being is so central, isn't it? I think it's central to a healthy culture. And I really appreciate what Lena was just saying about being able to have the conversation about whether or not you're okay. I think one of the lessons I've really learned over the last year or so during the pandemic, when, you know, certainly in the organizations where I've been working, all of my colleagues were working remotely very suddenly. You know, I went to work on a Monday, I went home that night, and I have not been back to the office since, and that was 15 months ago. And, you know, overnight we had to change. And as Lena was talking about, so many of our colleagues were very visibly, you know, suddenly the struggles that people have outside work became visible. They were sort of just here in the screen, you know, they were the child who's needing to sit on your knee while you're having a meeting, and they were all of those other things that were happening to people. And I think one of the real changes that I saw certainly in the teams where I was working was we actually made conscious decisions to have conversations together about how we were. And that became part of our normal practice within our team meetings, not just in one-to-ones, but wider conversations. And I certainly, in terms of leadership, I made a very deliberate decision to be much more open about how I was. I've always been quite private in some ways at work, you know, I hope I'm kind of warm and friendly, but I had quite a hard line about what I shared and what I didn't share. And I think in many ways that's, it's partly probably an outdated leadership model, but I think it's also sometimes something that as a woman who has, you know, come through in leadership over the last 30 years, you know, I'm 51 now, so I've come up through some different eras of leadership and organizational cultures, and had certainly had that pressure earlier in my career not to be emotional, you know, surrounded by male leaders and bosses. Don't be too emotional, don't be bringing all those things to work. And actually, I think that pendulum has swung. And one of the things that I really have gained in the last year or so is actually I kind of made that conscious decision to share more of myself and be more straightforward about how I was, to tell people when I was struggling, to say, you know, this is a tough day, isn't it? Or, you know, how are we all doing? You know, I'm not having a great time at the moment. How are you doing? And giving people a space where we could have those conversations safely and openly. And I think that created a very different a different kind of culture and a different context in the teams that I was working with. And I think that's something that has been a really important shift. It's a kind of paradox, isn't it? There are all these people I've been working really closely with, and I haven't been in the same space as them for over a year, but actually we've become closer to each other because we've had the courage to have those kinds of conversations. And I think it's a really important lesson. And so, you know, as Lena was saying last year, you know, around the George Floyd murder and all of those conversations, actually reaching out to people and saying, how are you? Are you okay? You know, I'm pretty shocked by all this. How are you? And being able to have that conversation and create space for people to express with confidence what they wanted to express about how they were feeling and know that that was going to be okay. I think that's the shift I would love us to really deliberately hang on to, because I think it's so important. This last year almost been awful in so many ways. Some people have had terrible experiences and great loss and grief, and I think we've all experienced terrible stress and difficulty in all kinds of different ways. We've kind of done it collectively, and I think in the best organizations we've managed to share that with each other, and I hope we don't lose that once we start getting back into how things used to be.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, but I also think, like, when we think about it in practice in the types of organizations that we work in, I think one of the real challenges is, so there's the willingness to just be different, right? And to, you know, feminists have this argument that the personal is political, which doesn't mean everything you do in your personal life is political. It means that to understand, you know, that our inner life is also structured by power, and that things that affect us are as a result of power. And so we need to kind of think about them and politicize them. And so if you create organizations, as many feminist organizations do, where you do check-ins on where people are at, you have, you know, amendments to, you know, the way that you work to accommodate, you know, kind of the different rhythm of women's lives, because, you know, we do like to say that men can also be carers, but if you look from a majority perspective, men generally aren't primary carers when it comes to children, to be honest, right? Or primary carers in the house still. That transition has yet to really happen for a majority. And so women are actually doing the bulk of the care work. I think where it gets difficult is actually the structures that we work in. So the registered NGO, the funded organization, have so many kind of both myths and requirements that actually restrict some of this. And I think we really need to interrogate that. So for example, one of the things that I've seen around the push around anti-racism in INGOs and in, you know, broader organizations has been the fact that board responses have always been very defensive. Now, to be honest with you, I'm not surprised, because one of the roles of the board is to actually mitigate risk. Claims of racism are prosecutable by law. And so same with claims of sexual harassment or rape or what have you. And so from a board perspective, it becomes less a question of how do we build an organization that respects rights and respects women's bodies and, you know, is anti-racist, and more a question of how do we protect ourselves from potential litigation, because that would cost the organization, right? So I think we have to think quite practically about what do we do with that, right? Secondly is the way that organizations are funded. There is no budget, even for better terms, right? Salaries can tend to be quite low. And there's often no room for example, adding on to maternity. You know, in a lot of African countries, maternity benefit is 4 months, which is insufficient. Actually, it forces women to have to go off the breast, for example, when we know that at six months, exclusive breastfeeding is actually the recommendation from WHO. But it is very difficult to exclusively breastfeed your child if you're going to work, right? For example. Not only that, the whole issue of how long it takes if you had a C-section to be able to properly recover and all the rest, 4 months is insufficient, to be fair. But most African women's organizations cannot afford to supplement the time, because the way that they're funded means that the lack of core funding and the lack of funding for salaries means that it's actually very difficult to have both somebody on full maternity pay and have maternity cover. So some of these issues are really structural, like I said. You know, the expectation of delivery, where does that come from? Quite a lot of it comes from donors. And so then the pressure then about really having to stick to timelines and make sure that you're delivering and what have you. So I feel like we need to think about the structures that we work in as well. Not all of this is a question of the individual will, even the individual will of leaders, positional leaders. It's also about some of the ways that the organizations and how they're structured, and some of the kind of policies and requirements and obligations. Some of them are, invisible, and some of them are explicit, that I think we also really need to interrogate.
Thanks, Jessica. Elena, do you have anything to add? We have structures, we have systems, and we are so scared of dismantling them. We fear that if we dismantle them, then we are all going to die. We have donor requirements, we have got governance boards, because some of the things we are discussing cannot happen in the current systems and structures the way they are, as Jessica said. So do we have the courage to dismantle them and still remain accountable, still do the work, still be beautiful, still support our constituencies, and at the same time, take care of them and ourselves? How possible is that, Helena?
Oh, I was just going to add another thing in that we need to consider, which is thinking about well-being and connecting it to other processes of change. The other element to this, of course, is about emotional labor, and it is about recognizing that that should be paid. And that is not something that we are engaged with already, I don't think, to accept or open up to, because it's a different way of thinking. A lot of the things that you mentioned, Hope, it's going to take a long time. But then within me, I have this balance of, okay, I understand it's going to take a long time and we need to get everyone on the same page. Then I'm like, how long is this going to take, and how long have we waited already, and how many more people need to be harmed until we change? So there must at least be some things that can be done. But a lot of, as Jessica has said, is because we are in a system where we are, like, obviously dependent on donors. So this does take directional change from them as well. But then can we also wait for that? And I think, no, we can't. Being the activist that I am, we should be able to take some power back into our own hands. And organizations, Francis, you're CEO of ActionAid, you have some certain power within ActionAid to be able to change things. Board members do as well. So, and even some people of color who do come together, I forget the word, organize, that's it. Come together and organize can influence change. And it's in a different way, but this will take a whole different way of our thinking. And is it that we dismantle the system that we have completely, or is it that we start to change something one by one from within, and we start to change it, and one organization starts and another and another and another? I don't think we can wait for donors, because it will take too long. And I think we need to just strive forward and start to commit. And it needs to be from the top, from the bottom, from the middle. It needs to be everybody trying to push forward to change one thing. And I think there's something in that, changing one thing about the way you check in, one thing about the way you write your policies, one thing about the way you work, one thing about pushing back on donors, maybe. I mean, maybe that is an option that could be there. For some organizations, maybe not for others. But also there's amazing stuff that's going on in the feminist sector that definitely we in the UK can learn from. And I think that that's something that we should be more mindful of.
I'm fine. Oh.
Yes.
I'm scared that. Oh, hold on.
Okay, let's see what happens. Mary Ann is having a hilarious day. We have talked about changing and those things that need to change. We may not overhaul the system, in a day, But surely there are little things we can do, and the organizations that are already doing that. Maybe what we haven't done is to document the success that we have made. What we haven't done is to look around and say who has done what and how is that working. And I think that is really, our challenge. So as we come to the end of the session, I'm going to ask each one of you to tell us your wise words that will give us courage to go back home. The last words that will energize us so that we can go home holding on to hope and knowing that tomorrow will be better. So I'll start with you, Elena, go to Francis, and then Jessica.
Oh no, I wanted to hear what they would say first. My one piece of wisdom. So many things. But I mean, Hope, anything that you say inspires me. So anything that Hope says, just take that on board. But also,
thank you.
For me, there is power in, like, every single individual has power to change something in the way that you act with people on an individual basis. You can change the way that you think about that. You can be intentional about how you speak to people, about how you treat them, about how you bring them in. And that's power that we have within our own grasp. But it will take all of us to make change. And this is too important not to. It will benefit everyone, and we can make change together.
Shall I jump in, Hope? I think I was next in line. Thank you.
Yeah.
Lena, I think what you've just said is exactly it. We all have a role to play. I'm in the very fortunate position as of this week of being chief executive of a large NGO, which gives me a lot of potential. There's a lot of levers I can pull. But what I also know from my own life and from what I see around me is that every single person can create change. I think the other lesson that I hold on to is that just have the courage to know that you're going to fail some of the time. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to say the wrong thing. You're going to try things that don't work. I think often, particularly, I think in the space where we're talking about anti-racist work, there can be a terrible fear of getting it wrong, which can be paralyzing. And I think one of the things that I encourage us all to do is to actually support each other to learn and to do good things. Hold each other accountable too. This isn't about letting people off the hook when they're, deliberately doing the wrong thing or deliberately doing nothing. But I think when we're trying to do this work together, I think there's something very important about acknowledging our own shortcomings and that we won't get everything right first time. And what we have to do is try and support each other to do better each time and learn from the mistakes that we make on the way. Because otherwise, as Jessica was saying, the instinct for leaders and for trustees and for donors is to retreat and not engage with it. So I think there is something about us creating a space where we can be angry about the things we need to be angry about, but we can support each other to do the tough things and sometimes not be perfect in doing that first time.
Thanks very much, Francis. And we'll be visiting you in a year's time to do a case study of how change really happens and how well-being can be part of the day-to-day practices of an organization. Congratulations once again, and we wish you well in your new venture. We look forward to working with you. Jessica, you are going to bring the closing remarks, bringing in the feminist perspective, the collectiveness of well-being, and the contextual, and its contextuality. So over to you, Jessica.
Well, I think, I agree. I think that this is about intention. It's very easy to say things. What we need to do is have you say them because you mean them. So this is about intention. And so it requires deep self-reflexivity. Everybody needs to really think about the extent to which what they do contributes to or dismantles hegemonic or mainstream power, oppressive power. But that we also, again, as I was saying, in as much as this work is political, cannot forget the collective viewpoint. So I I agree. I want to see what Frances does, but it's not only her. She can't do it alone. It's not, and it almost to almost expect, because I think we still have this idea of individual heroes coming to save us, when in reality, what social movements show us is that we are the heroes, all of us. We are the ones we've been waiting for, is what June Jordan said, right, in that poem. That's it, right? We are the ones. We're the ones that have to change. So the change is all of us on this call. We're the ones that have to begin and to support the wave in all of these dimensions, support different ways of being. When people are experimenting with doing things differently, help them out, be proactively supportive of them, engage in the experiment, right? And that again, lastly, to remember that what we do is shifting power. And you must remember that you can't, it's hard to shift power in a way where nothing changes. The whole point is for things to change. And when things change, it means that some people lose a bit of their mainstream power. And so I think that's something that also we have to understand will happen too. Because I think what we're trying to do in a lot of this change processes is to change things, but let most things stay the same. And that can't be the way that we proceed. So we just have to take a deep breath and assume that a lot of things are going to change in terms of how we relate and how we structure. And that is what it takes to create a new form, right? So I think, again, center in your self-reflexive practice, in your critical practice, be in solidarity and be brave. And solidarity is one way of being in collectives, right? Show your solidarity and practice. And again, ensure that it is not just what you say, it's what you mean.
Yeah, thanks very much for, oh my God, where do we even start from? Thanks so much for kicking off the conversation. Thanks very much for showing us that well-being is not by the way, it's the way things should be. We all work for the well-being of everyone. That's what our work is about. We can't afford to ignore a chunk of our work and put it in the footnote. Then what are we doing? What are we delivering so assiduously that we forget about our own well-being? You have reminded us that when we are fragmented, the whole organization gets fragmented, and so does our work. You've reminded us that well-being is collective, and it's not work of one person. So my watching Francis is just a case study, but at the end of the day, we have to support you and we have to support other activists. Thanks for reminding us that well-being is really, really comprehensive. It has got issues of gender, issues of race, issues of sexuality, issues of geographical location. It's big. It's not just one thing. You can't just take a dot and say, oh, this is well-being, I'm going to jump on this. We have got to be comprehensive and to understand and take a holistic approach. Thanks so much for showing up, for being honest, for being open about your own experience, for sharing your experiences openly. Thanks very much. We really appreciate, and let's clap hands for you.
Thank you all. And I think you can maybe hear me now, and I'm not going to talk a lot, but I've put the link for the next session into the chat. There's a session starting shortly with Hope and I. We're going to talk more about the conversations that we held through the initiative last year in different regions and what we learned from them. And so if you'd like to join us for that, the link is there in the chat on the event and on the stage, and we'd love to see you. And also, if you can't join us for that, but you want to join something else, do come back when you want to through the scheduled events. And my thanks also to Jessica, to Francis and to Lena. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry about my tech issues.
Thank you very much.
Bye.